She was given in marriage to a man everyone called a monster, but nothing about him was what they said. Behind those cold eyes lay an old pain, and a heart he swore no longer existed. In the days that followed, she discovered that his silence hid tenderness, and that every gesture was a way of loving he didn't know how to show. Without realizing it, she stopped dreaming of freedom and started wishing she could stay. The ancient stone church of St. Michael stood silent against the grey Yorkshire sky, its weathered walls bearing witness to countless unions forged in love, duty, and sometimes desperation. Today, it would host another, one born of necessity rather than choice. Evelyn Margaret Whitmore adjusted the delicate lace of her ivory gown, her fingers trembling despite her best efforts to maintain composure. The dress had belonged to her grandmother, altered hastily in the past week to fit her slender frame. It was beautiful, she supposed, though beauty felt irrelevant when walking toward a future she hadn't chosen. Through the tall windows, she could see the rolling hills of the Yorkshire Dales, painted in shades of emerald and gold under the autumn sun. How different this day might have been under other circumstances, perhaps filled with laughter, tears of joy, and the warm embrace of family gathered in celebration. Instead, the church held fewer than a dozen souls, all bound by obligation rather than affection. Her father, William Whitmore, sat in the front pew, his once robust frame now gaunt from months of illness that had ravaged both his body and their family's finances. His eyes, once bright with the intelligence that had made him a respected professor at Cambridge, now held the dull weight of a man who had run out of options. When he looked at her, she saw both love and crushing guilt, the terrible burden of a father who had been forced to trade his daughter's freedom for her security. "Miss Whitmore?" The priest's gentle voice drew her attention. Father Morrison had baptized her 28 years ago in this very church, had watched her grow from a curious child into a thoughtful young woman. Today, his kind eyes held a sadness that mirrored her own. Are you ready? If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. She nodded, though ready felt like an impossible concept. How could anyone be ready to marry a stranger? How could anyone be ready to surrender their life to a man whose reputation preceded him like a shadow? The heavy oak doors opened with a creak that echoed through the nave, and her breath caught in her throat. Alexander Thorne walked through the doorway, and the very air seemed to shift around him. She had seen him only once before, during the brief meeting when the arrangements were finalized, but his presence still took her by surprise. He was tall, intimidatingly so, with broad shoulders that filled his charcoal grey suit to perfection. His dark hair was swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, strong jaw, aristocratic nose, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Everything about him spoke of power, control, and danger. The rumors whispered through Yorkshire's social circles painted him as ruthless in business, cold in personal matters, and utterly without mercy for those who crossed him. Yet as his gaze found hers across the church, something flickered in those grey eyes, something that vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. A softness, perhaps, or recognition of something deeper than the contract that bound them. He moved down the aisle with the fluid grace of a predator, his steps measured and confident, but his eyes never left her face. When he reached the altar, he positioned himself beside her, maintaining a respectful distance that somehow felt both considerate and isolating. Up close, she could see the fine details that distance had obscured, the subtle silver threading in his suit, the platinum watch that caught the light from the stained glass windows, the faint scent of sandalwood, and something uniquely masculine that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. Father Morrison began the ceremony with words that had bound countless couples before them, but Evelyn barely heard the familiar phrases. She was too aware of the man beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth that seemed to radiate from his tall frame, the way his hands remained perfectly still at his sides, while hers trembled like autumn leaves. When the moment came for them to face each other, Alexander turned toward her with a movement so fluid it seemed rehearsed. His eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to just the two of them. She searched his face for any hint of the cruel businessman she'd heard about, but found instead something that looked almost like protection. The thought was ridiculous, she told herself. Men like Alexander Thorne didn't protect. They possessed. "Do you, Alexander James Thorne, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Father Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. "I do." His voice was deep, controlled, carrying an authority that had commanded boardrooms and bent competitors to his will. But when he spoke those two simple words while looking at her, they carried a weight that surprised them both. "Do you, Evelyn Margaret Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The words stuck in her throat for a moment. This was her last chance, her final opportunity to flee, to choose uncertainty over this gilded cage. But when she glanced toward her father, saw the hope and desperation warring in his features, she knew she couldn't abandon him now. "I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stone sanctuary. The ring Alexander placed on her finger was exquisite, a vintage piece with delicate engravings that spoke of thoughtfulness rather than mere expense. As his fingers brushed hers during the exchange, she felt an unexpected jolt of electricity that made her breath catch. His hands were warm, strong, with long fingers that handled the delicate band with surprising gentleness. "You may kiss the bride," Father Morrison announced, and Evelyn's heart began to race. Alexander's eyes searched hers for permission, and in that moment of hesitation, she saw something that challenged everything she thought she knew about him. Uncertainty, as if he, too, was navigating uncharted waters. When she gave the slightest nod, he stepped closer, his hand rising to cup her cheek with a tenderness that belied his fearsome reputation. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it left her dizzy nonetheless. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft, and when he pulled away she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in his eyes before the mask of composure slipped back into place. As they turned to face the small gathering, now legally bound as husband and wife, Evelyn felt the weight of her new reality settling around her like a heavy cloak. She was Mrs. Alexander Thorne now, wife to a man who could buy and sell entire companies before breakfast, stepmother to a business empire that spanned continents. But as they walked down the aisle together, his hand firm and steady beneath hers, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this arrangement and to this man than anyone had told her. The way his thumb brushed across her knuckles as they walked suggested a consideration that didn't match his reputation. The careful way he adjusted his longer stride to match hers spoke of awareness and respect. Outside the church, a sleek black Bentley waited to carry them to their new life together. As Alexander helped her into the car, his hand lingering just a moment longer than necessary on her waist, Evelyn wondered if she was stepping into a prison or something else entirely. The Yorkshire countryside blurred past the windows as they drove in silence toward Thornfield Manor, the estate that had been in Alexander's family for generations. With each mile that passed, Evelyn felt herself moving further from everything familiar and deeper into the unknown territory of her new existence as Mrs. Alexander Thorne. Thornfield Manor rose from the Yorkshire landscape like something from a fairy tale, its honey-coloured stone walls glowing in the late afternoon sun. Evelyn pressed her face to the car window, taking in the magnificent estate that was now, impossibly, her home. Gardens stretched in every direction, perfectly manicured lawns giving way to ancient oak trees, whose branches had probably sheltered generations of thorns before Alexander. The manor itself was breathtaking. 3 stories of Georgian architecture, with tall windows that caught the light like jewels. Ivy climbed the eastern wall in elegant patterns, and she could see the gleam of a conservatory extending from the south wing. It was beautiful beyond anything she had imagined, and yet the very grandeur of it made her feel smaller, more insignificant. "It's magnificent," she said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them during the 40-minute drive from the church. Alexander followed her gaze, and for a moment his expression softened. "It's been in my family for over 2 centuries. My great-great-grandfather built it for his bride." He paused as if realizing the irony of his words. "I hope you'll find it comfortable." The car drew to a stop before the main entrance, where a woman in her 50s waited with perfect posture and a kind smile. She was dressed elegantly but practically, her silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon that spoke of efficiency and warmth in equal measure. "Mrs. Caldwell has been managing the household for 15 years, Alexander explained, as he stepped out of the car and moved around to open Evelyn's door. "She'll help you settle in and ensure you have everything you need." His hand was steady as he helped her from the car, and again she felt that unexpected warmth at his touch. He released her quickly, as if the contact affected him as much as it did her, and turned to address the waiting woman. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is my wife, Evelyn." The word wife seemed to catch slightly in his throat, as if he were still adjusting to its reality. "Please ensure she feels welcome." "Of course, sir." "Welcome to Thornfield, Mrs. Thorne." Mrs. Caldwell's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that immediately put Evelyn at ease. "I've prepared the blue suite for you, as requested." Evelyn caught the meaningful glance that passed between Alexander and the housekeeper, though she couldn't decipher its significance. As they entered the manor, she was struck by the perfect balance between grandeur and warmth. The entrance hall soared 2 stories high, with a magnificent staircase that curved gracefully to the upper floors, but comfortable seating areas and fresh flowers made the space feel welcoming rather than intimidating. "I'll show you to your room," Alexander said, his tone carefully neutral. "You'll want to rest and adjust." They climbed the staircase in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runner that flowed down the center of each step. Evelyn was acutely aware of Alexander beside her, the way his hand barely grazed the banister, the controlled power in his movements. When they reached the 2nd floor, he led her down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and pastoral landscapes. He stopped before a door painted in soft cream, his hand resting on the brass handle for a moment before turning it. "This will be your room," he said, stepping aside to let her enter first. Evelyn gasped softly as she stepped across the threshold. The room was exquisite, clearly designed with a woman's comfort in mind. Soft blues and creams dominated the color palette, from the silk wallpaper to the luxurious bedding on the 4-poster bed. French doors led to a private balcony that overlooked the gardens, and a cozy sitting area by the fireplace included a small writing desk and comfortable armchair. "It's beautiful," she breathed, moving to touch the silk curtains that framed the windows. "But I thought, aren't we supposed to—" She felt heat rise in her cheeks, unable to finish the question. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You'll sleep here," he said firmly, "alone, until you feel comfortable with other arrangements." The implication hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Evelyn turned to study his face, trying to understand this man who defied every expectation she'd formed. His reputation painted him as someone who took what he wanted without consideration for others, yet here he was, offering her something she hadn't dared hope for: time. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "The marriage contract. The contract ensured your father's medical expenses would be covered and provided you with security," Alexander interrupted, his voice taking on the authoritative tone she imagined he used in business. "Nothing more. Nothing intimate will happen between us until you choose it." He moved toward the door, clearly intending to leave her alone with this revelation, but she found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "Why?" He paused, his hand on the doorframe, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally turned back to her, she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. "Because I've taken enough from you already," he said simply. "I won't take that too." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone in the beautiful room that felt both like a sanctuary and a prison. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her wedding dress spreading around her like spilled cream, and tried to process what had just happened. She had married a stranger to save her father's life, prepared herself for the worst, and instead found herself with a man who seemed determined to protect her from himself. It was confusing, unexpected, and more frightening than if he had simply been the monster she'd expected. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Thorne?" "Mrs." Caldwell's voice was gentle. "May I come in?" "Please," Evelyn called, grateful for the company. The housekeeper entered, carrying a tea tray laden with delicate china and what looked like fresh scones. "I thought you might need some refreshment. It's been quite a day." As Mrs. Caldwell set the tray on the small table by the fireplace and began pouring tea, Evelyn found herself studying the older woman's face. There was kindness there, but also a sort of protective loyalty that suggested deep affection for her employer. "He's not what people say, you know," Mrs. Caldwell said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Master Alexander. Oh, he can be fierce in business. Has to be, running an empire like his. But he's got a good heart. Lost his way a bit over the years, perhaps, but good all the same. Everyone seems afraid of him, Evelyn murmured, accepting the delicate cup of tea. Respect and fear often look the same from the outside, Mrs. Caldwell replied diplomatically. But I've seen him sit by a sick tenant farmer's bedside all night, seen him pay for a village child's surgery without expecting thanks or recognition. He doesn't want people to know about his kindness, thinks it makes him vulnerable in business. Evelyn sipped her tea, processing this information. He gave me my own room. He did. Mrs. Caldwell's smile was knowing. Surprised you, did it? A man with his reputation. I don't know what to think, Evelyn admitted. I was prepared for something very different. Master Alexander doesn't do anything without careful consideration, the housekeeper said, settling into the chair across from her. Every decision is calculated, thought through from every angle, including this marriage. The words sent a chill through Evelyn. What do you mean? Mrs. Caldwell seemed to realize she'd said too much. Just that he's not impulsive, dear. If he's treating you with consideration, it's because he's chosen to. That's worth remembering. After the housekeeper left, Evelyn found herself alone with her thoughts and a room full of unexpected luxuries. In the wardrobe, she discovered a complete wardrobe of clothing in her exact size, elegant dresses, casual wear, even nightgowns of the finest silk. On the bedside table sat a stack of books, and when she examined the titles, her breath caught. Everyone was from her favorite authors, books she'd mentioned loving in their single conversation before the wedding. How had he remembered such details? More importantly, why had he bothered? As evening fell and she changed into one of the silk nightgowns, Evelyn caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her was still recognizable, but something fundamental had changed. She was no longer Evelyn Whitmore, the professor's daughter struggling to care for her ailing father. She was Mrs. Alexander Thorne, wife to one of England's most powerful men. The question that haunted her as she settled into the impossibly comfortable bed was simple. What did Alexander Thorne expect to gain from a wife who was essentially a stranger? And why did the thought of finding out both terrify and intrigue her in equal measure? Outside her window, the Yorkshire night settled over Thornfield Manor like a velvet curtain, and somewhere in this vast house, her new husband was beginning what she suspected would be a very long journey of learning to live with the consequences of their mutual sacrifice. The first week at Thornfield Manor passed in a strange sort of limbo. Alexander left each morning before dawn, his footsteps barely audible in the corridor outside her room, and returned well after dinner, when the house had settled into its evening quiet. They were like ghosts haunting the same beautiful space, aware of each other but never quite connecting. Yet Evelyn began to notice things, small thoughtful gestures that spoke louder than words ever could. Each morning, she found her favorite tea waiting in the breakfast room, still steaming in a delicate spode cup that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. Not the Earl Grey that most households served, but the delicate jasmine blend she'd mentioned loving during their brief courtship conversation. Mrs. Caldwell claimed ignorance when asked about it, but her knowing smile suggested otherwise. The library became Evelyn's refuge during those long, solitary days. It was a magnificent room that spanned 2 stories, with floor-to-ceiling shelves connected by a graceful spiral staircase and a rolling ladder that allowed access to the highest volumes. The first time she'd explored it, she'd been overwhelmed by the sheer number of books, thousands of volumes covering everything from classical literature to modern philosophy. But as the days passed, she began to notice new additions appearing on the reading table by the window, books that hadn't been there the day before, all carefully selected from genres she adored. When she'd mentioned to Mrs. Caldwell that she enjoyed mystery novels, a first-edition Agatha Christie appeared the next morning. After she'd spent an afternoon reading poetry aloud to herself, a volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning materialized beside her favorite chair. Someone was listening even when she thought she was alone. The realization both warmed and unsettled her. Alexander Thorne was proving to be a far more complex man than his reputation suggested, and she found herself increasingly curious about the mind behind these thoughtful gestures. On Thursday evening, she decided to venture into the kitchen, drawn by a longing to cook that had been growing stronger each day. At home, preparing meals had been one of her greatest pleasures, a creative outlet that brought comfort to both herself and her father. The kitchen at Thornfield was a chef's dream, with modern appliances seamlessly integrated into the traditional space, but she hesitated at the threshold, uncertain of her place in this household. "Mrs. Thorne?" Cook, a cheerful woman named Sarah, looked up from her preparations with surprise and delight. "Whatever brings you to my domain?" "I was hoping, that is, I wondered if I might." Evelyn found herself stumbling over the words, feeling foolish. "I enjoy cooking, and I thought perhaps I could help with dinner preparation." Sarah's face lit up. "Help? My dear, you're the mistress of this house. You could command me to prepare anything your heart desires, but if you'd like to cook together, I'd be honored. Master Alexander doesn't often have company for dinner, and I sometimes worry he doesn't eat enough when he's working late." The comment struck Evelyn as oddly domestic and caring, not at all what she'd expected regarding the fearsome Alexander Thorne. As she tied an apron around her waist and began helping Sarah prepare a roasted chicken with herbs from the manor's garden, she found herself asking casual questions about her absent husband. "Has he always worked such long hours?" "Oh, bless him, yes. Ever since—" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful as she kneaded bread dough. "Well, ever since his family troubles some years back. Throws himself into business like it's the only thing keeping him anchored. Though I will say, he's been coming home a bit earlier this week." Evelyn's hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. "He has?" Usually doesn't get back until well past 9, but this week he's been arriving by 8, asking about dinner, making sure there's enough prepared." Sarah's knowing look made Evelyn's cheeks warm. "I think he's hoping to dine with his new wife, though he's too proud to say so directly." The thought sent an unexpected flutter through Evelyn's chest. She'd assumed Alexander was avoiding her, when perhaps he was simply trying to give her space, while hoping for some sign that his company would be welcome. That evening, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of taking her usual solitary dinner in the morning room, she asked Mrs. Caldwell to set the formal dining room for 2, and to inform Alexander that she would be dining at 8, should he care to join her. At 5 minutes to 8, she stood before the mirror in her room, smoothing her hands over the emerald green dress she'd chosen, one of the mysterious additions to her wardrobe that fit her perfectly. Her reflection showed a woman she barely recognized, elegant, poised, but with nervous energy that betrayed her uncertainty about the evening ahead. The grandfather clock in the hall was chiming 8 when she entered the dining room. The long mahogany table had been set for 2 at one end, creating an intimate space within the grand room. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting dancing shadows on the painted walls, and fresh flowers from the conservatory filled the air with the scent of jasmine and roses. She had just taken her seat when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. Alexander appeared in the doorway, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the candle-lit space. He had changed from his business attire into a charcoal grey suit that made his eyes appear even more striking, and his usually perfectly controlled hair showed the faintest disarray, as if he'd run his fingers through it. "I wasn't certain you'd come," Evelyn said softly, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. "I wasn't certain you'd want me to." His voice held an unfamiliar hesitancy as he moved to the chair across from her. "Thank you for the invitation." As Mrs. Caldwell and Sarah served the meal Evelyn had helped prepare, she found herself studying Alexander's profile in the candlelight. The harsh lines of his face seemed softer in the warm glow, and when he complimented the chicken, she felt a ridiculous surge of pride. "I helped prepare it," she admitted. "I hope you don't mind. I've always enjoyed cooking." Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or approval. "You cooked this?" "Sarah did most of the work. I just assisted." She took a sip of wine to steady her nerves. "At home, cooking was one of my few creative outlets. I hope it's not inappropriate for me to—" "It's not inappropriate," he interrupted gently. "It's your home now. You should feel free to use it as you wish." The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither seemed ready to explore. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the clink of silver on china, and the soft crackle of the fire the only sounds in the room. Evelyn found herself stealing glances at Alexander, noting how he ate with precise, economical movements, how his attention seemed completely focused on the meal she'd helped create. "The books," she said suddenly, then blushed at her own boldness. "In the library, the ones that keep appearing. Are they from you?" Alexander's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and she saw a flush creep up his neck. You mentioned your preferences once. I thought the library should reflect the interests of everyone who uses it. It was a diplomatic answer, but the slight roughness in his voice suggested it cost him something to give it. Evelyn felt emboldened by his obvious discomfort. It made him seem more human, less like the untouchable business titan everyone described. Thank you, she said simply. It means more than you might realize, feeling considered. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the careful politeness dropped away. She saw something raw and vulnerable in his gaze, quickly hidden but unmistakable. He cleared his throat and reached for his wineglass, breaking the intensity of the moment. I'll be traveling to London tomorrow, he said, his tone returning to its usual controlled cadence. Business meetings that couldn't be postponed. I'll be gone for 3 days. Evelyn felt an unexpected pang of disappointment, just as they seemed to be finding some common ground. He was leaving. I see. If you need anything while I'm away, Mrs. Caldwell will take care of it. Or, he hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card. My personal mobile number, if there's an emergency, or if you simply need anything. The card was warm from being close to his body, and when their fingers brushed as she took it, she felt that same electric jolt that had surprised her during their wedding ceremony. This time she noticed he felt it too. His intake of breath was sharp, barely audible, but she caught it. As the evening wound down and they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, Alexander paused at the foot of the staircase. Evelyn? The sound of her name in his deep voice sent shivers down her spine. Yes? The jasmine tea, the books, the... He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing all the small kindnesses she'd been noticing. I want you to feel at home here. Not like a guest, but like this is truly your place. Before she could respond, he was climbing the stairs with those long, purposeful strides, leaving her standing in the entrance hall, with her heart racing and her mind spinning with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Alexander had been gone for 2 days when the storm arrived, with the fury of nature unleashed. Evelyn had spent the morning reading in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants and the gentle patter of rain against the glass ceiling. But as afternoon gave way to evening, the gentle shower transformed into something altogether more violent. Thunder rolled across the Yorkshire dales like the voice of an angry god, rattling the ancient windows of Thornfield Manor. Lightning split the sky in brilliant, terrifying displays that illuminated the gardens in stark, momentary detail, before plunging them back into darkness. The wind howled around the manor's stone walls, finding every gap and crevice to whistle through with haunting intensity. Evelyn tried to distract herself with dinner, then with a book, but each crash of thunder made her flinch involuntarily. She'd harbored an irrational fear of storms since childhood, a terror that logic could never quite overcome. The phobia had developed after she'd been caught in a violent thunderstorm at age 7, when lightning had struck a tree mere yards from where she'd been playing. The memory of that deafening crack and the smell of burning wood still haunted her during weather like this. By 10 o'clock, she'd given up any pretense of normalcy and retreated to her room, changing into a silk nightgown and robe before curling up in the window seat with a cup of chamomile tea. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger. Each flash of lightning illuminated the gardens in ghostly detail, and she found herself counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, a childhood habit that did little to calm her racing heart. She had just closed her eyes and pressed her hands over her ears during a particularly violent crash, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her room, heavy, purposeful strides that she recognized instantly, despite their impossibility. A gentle knock came at her door, followed by a voice that made her heart skip entirely. "Evelyn? Are you all right?" She flew to the door, forgetting her state of undress in her relief and confusion. When she pulled it open, Alexander stood in the hallway, his dark hair damp from rain, his usually immaculate suit replaced by dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that clung to his broad shoulders. He looked more approachable than she'd ever seen him, more human and less like the untouchable businessman who commanded boardrooms with a look. "Alexander, I thought you were in London." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, relief evident in every syllable. His grey eyes swept over her face, taking in what must have been obvious signs of distress. I was. I drove back when I saw the weather reports. He paused, his gaze flickering briefly to her silk-clad form before returning respectfully to her face. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned you might not. That storms sometimes. Another thunderclap shook the house, and Evelyn involuntarily stepped closer to him, her hands clenching in the silk of her robe. She saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, watched his hands flex at his sides as if fighting the urge to reach for her. "You came back because of the storm?" she asked quietly, hardly daring to believe it. "I came back because you're afraid of storms, and I couldn't bear the thought of you facing one alone." The admission seemed to cost him something, his voice rougher than usual. Would you like some company until it passes?" The vulnerable hope in his question undid something inside her chest. This powerful man, who commanded respect and fear in equal measure, was asking permission to comfort her with all the careful courtesy of a nervous suitor. Without thinking, she stepped back and gestured for him to enter. Alexander moved into her room with the fluid grace she was beginning to associate with him, but she noticed the way his eyes carefully avoided the intimate space of her bedroom, focusing instead on the sitting area by the fireplace. When lightning flashed again, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor, she couldn't suppress a small cry of alarm. This time, he didn't fight his instincts. In 2 swift strides, he was beside her, his hands coming up to frame her face with surprising gentleness. "Hey," he murmured, his voice dropping to a soothing rumble. "You're safe. The manor has weathered storms for over 2 centuries. This old girl isn't going anywhere." But his nearness was doing things to her pulse that had nothing to do with fear of the storm. Up close, she could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes, could smell the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely masculine that made her feel dizzy. His thumbs traced gentle arcs across her cheekbones, and she realized with a start that she was leaning into his touch like a flower seeking sunlight. "I know it's irrational," she whispered, acutely aware of how intimate this moment felt. Standing in her nightgown in the soft lamplight, his strong hands cradling her face as if she were something precious and fragile. "I've been terrified of storms since I was a child." "Fear doesn't have to be rational to be real," he replied, his voice so gentle it made her chest ache. "When I was young, I was terrified of the dark after reading too many ghost stories. My sister used to—" He stopped abruptly, his hands dropping from her face as if he'd revealed too much. But Evelyn had caught the slip, the brief glimpse into a past he kept carefully guarded. "You have a sister?" Pain flickered across his features so quickly she almost missed it. I had a sister." The simple past tense told her everything and nothing. She wanted to ask more, to understand the shadow that had just crossed his face, but another thunderclap made her jump, and he immediately refocused on her comfort. "Would you like me to stay until the storm passes?" he asked again, and this time she didn't hesitate. "Please." He settled into the armchair near the fireplace while she curled up on the small sofa, pulling a throw around herself for both warmth and modesty. For a while they sat in companionable silence, the storm raging outside while the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Alexander's presence was incredibly calming, solid, protective, like an anchor in the chaos of wind and rain. "Tell me about London," she said eventually, desperate for any distraction from the weather. "Your meetings." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness she hadn't heard before. "Acquisitions. A company that's been mismanaged into near bankruptcy. Normally I'd simply absorb the profitable divisions and eliminate the rest, but—" He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "They employ nearly 300 people, families who depend on those jobs." Evelyn studied his profile in the firelight, seeing again the complexity that lay beneath his reputation. "What will you do?" "Restructure rather than destroy. It'll cost more in the short term, require more of my personal involvement, but most of those jobs can be saved." He glanced at her, something almost vulnerable in his expression. "Business associates think I'm going soft." "Are you?" A smile ghosted across his lips, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Perhaps, though I prefer to think of it as evolved." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, but this time Evelyn barely flinched. She was too absorbed in watching Alexander, in the way the firelight played across his strong features. in the gradual relaxation of his usually rigid posture. "Why did you really come back?" she asked softly. The truth this time. He was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes reflecting the dancing flames. When he finally answered, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you facing the storm alone. Because somewhere between here and London, I realized that your fear had become mine because—" He met her eyes directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Because you're my wife, and protecting you has become more important than any business meeting." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that neither seemed ready to fully explore. Outside, the storm was beginning to lose its fury, the thunder growing more distant, but neither of them moved to end this unexpected intimacy. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't name. "For coming back, for staying, for caring." Alexander's hands clenched into fists on the arms of his chair, and she saw him swallow hard before speaking. "Caring about you, Evelyn, is becoming dangerously easy." The admission sent heat coursing through her veins, and she had to resist the urge to cross the small space between them. Something fundamental was shifting in the dynamic between them, like the eye of a storm passing overhead to reveal clear skies beyond. But neither of them was quite ready to step into that clarity yet. As the thunder faded to distant rumbles and her eyelids grew heavy, Evelyn felt safer than she had in months. When she finally drifted off to sleep on the sofa, wrapped in cashmere and lulled by the steady rhythm of Alexander's breathing, she missed the way he watched over her through the rest of the night, his grey eyes soft with a tenderness that would have surprised anyone who knew only his public face. Evelyn woke to sunlight streaming through her windows and the gentle sounds of birds singing in the gardens. For a moment she was disoriented, her mind foggy with sleep and the lingering memory of storm-filled dreams. Then she became aware of the soft cashmere throw tucked carefully around her shoulders and the faint scent of sandalwood that could only belong to one person. Alexander was gone, but evidence of his night-long vigil remained. The armchair still bore the impression of his tall frame, and on the side table sat a cup of her favorite jasmine tea, still warm beneath a delicate china saucer. Beside it lay a single white rose from the Manor's gardens, its petals still kissed with morning dew. She sat up slowly, her heart doing something complicated in her chest as she reached for the flower. No note accompanied it, but none was needed. The gesture spoke volumes about the man who had driven through a storm to comfort her, who had spent the night watching over her sleep with the patience of a guardian angel. The next few days passed in a strange sort of dance. Alexander no longer disappeared before dawn or returned after dinner. Instead, he began joining her for meals, their conversations gradually extending beyond polite pleasantries into something deeper, more substantial. She discovered he had read extensively on topics ranging from classical literature to modern economics, that he spoke 3 languages fluently, and that he possessed a dry wit that occasionally surfaced when he forgot to maintain his carefully controlled facade. But it was the small intimacies that began to affect her most profoundly. The way he held her chair when she rose from the dinner table, his hand briefly resting on her shoulder with proprietary warmth. How he automatically moved to her left side when they walked through the gardens, positioning himself between her and any potential threat, with an unconscious protectiveness that made her pulse quicken. The way his eyes would find her across a room and linger there, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. On Thursday afternoon, she decided to venture into the kitchen again, drawn by the therapeutic nature of cooking and a growing desire to create something special for their evening meal. She found Sarah elbow-deep in preparations for what appeared to be a feast. "Expecting company?" Evelyn asked, tying an apron around her waist. "The master mentioned he'd like to dine in tonight," Sarah replied with a knowing smile. "Said to prepare something special. I think he's trying to impress someone." The thought sent warmth spiraling through Evelyn's stomach. Then we should make sure it's worthy of his efforts. They worked side by side for the next 2 hours, Evelyn losing herself in the familiar rhythms of chopping, seasoning, and tasting. She prepared her grandmother's recipe for beef Wellington, a complex dish that required patience and skill, while Sarah crafted delicate side dishes and a chocolate soufflé that was Alexander's admitted weakness. As she worked, Evelyn found herself humming softly, something she hadn't done since before her father's illness. There was something deeply satisfying about creating beauty with her hands, about knowing that Alexander would taste something she had crafted with care and attention. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear his footsteps in the corridor. When his voice spoke behind her, low and amused, she jumped nearly out of her skin. "I didn't expect to find my wife in the kitchen, covered in flour." Evelyn spun around, suddenly acutely aware of her appearance. Her hair had escaped its neat chignon and was curling around her face from the heat of the kitchen, and she could feel flour dusting her cheek where she'd unconsciously brushed it with the back of her hand. Her apron was stained with various ingredients, and she probably looked like a complete mess. But when she met Alexander's eyes, she saw something there that made her breath catch. His gaze was intense, almost hungry, as it traveled over her disheveled appearance. When his eyes returned to her face, the pupils were dilated, and his hands were clenched at his sides as if he were fighting some internal battle. "I wanted to cook for you," she said softly, inexplicably nervous under his scrutiny. "As a thank you. For the other night, for—" "You don't need to thank me for anything," he interrupted, his voice rougher than usual. He took a step closer, then stopped abruptly, as if remembering where they were. "You look disastrous, I'm sure," she laughed, self-consciously reaching up to tuck a wayward curl behind her ear. "Beautiful," he finished quietly, the single word falling between them like a stone into still water. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm. Evelyn was acutely aware of everything. The way Alexander's chest rose and fell with controlled breathing, the way his grey eyes had darkened to the colour of storm clouds, the subtle tension in his jaw that suggested he was keeping himself on a very tight leash. I should let you finish," he said finally, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his tall frame, close enough to catch the subtle scent of his cologne mingled with something uniquely masculine. "Alexander," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for, but knowing that something fundamental was shifting between them. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently brushed the flour from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent electricity shooting through her entire nervous system. His hand lingered against her face, and she found herself leaning into the warmth of his palm. "You're making this very difficult," he murmured, his thumb tracing a gentle arc across her cheekbone. "Making what difficult?" "Keeping my distance, remembering that you didn't choose this, respecting the boundaries I promised to maintain." His voice was strained, as if each word cost him something. "You have flour in your hair." Before she could respond, his other hand came up to gently work a dusting of flour from the dark strands that had escaped her chignon. The gesture was intimate, protective, and she found herself moving closer without conscious thought. They were standing so close now that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She could see the conflict there, desire warring with restraint, want battling with honor. His hands framed her face with infinite gentleness, and she realized with a start that she was trembling. "Evelyn," he said, her name a prayer and a warning all at once. "Yes? If you don't step away from me right now, I'm going to do something we might both regret." The words should have frightened her, should have sent her fleeing to the safety of distance and propriety. Instead, they sent heat coursing through her veins and made her pulse race with anticipation rather than fear. "What if I don't want to step away?" His intake of breath was sharp, audible. For a moment she thought he might kiss her right there in the kitchen, with Sarah just around the corner and the beef Wellington requiring her attention. The intensity in his gaze suggested he was considering exactly that. But then footsteps sounded in the corridor, and Alexander stepped back abruptly, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his tell when he was fighting for control. "Mrs. Thorne," Mrs. Caldwell's voice called, "there's a telephone call for you, your father's doctor." The spell broken, Evelyn rushed to take the call, her heart pounding for entirely different reasons now. But as she hurried from the kitchen, she caught sight of Alexander's reflection in the window. He was standing where she'd left him, his hands braced against the counter, his head bowed as if in defeat. The phone call brought good news. Her father's latest tests showed marked improvement, and the treatments Alexander's money had made possible were working better than anyone had dared hope. But when she returned to share the news, Alexander was gone, and Sarah informed her that he'd received an urgent business call and would be dining out that evening. The beef Wellington, prepared with such care and hope, sat untouched in the kitchen, a monument to missed opportunities and the growing tension that neither of them seemed able to navigate. As Evelyn ate dinner alone in the formal dining room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something precious had slipped through her fingers, and that Alexander was running from whatever was building between them with the same determination he brought to his business dealings. But she was no longer content to be a passive participant in their strange dance. Alexander Thorne might be accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, but he was about to discover that his wife possessed a will every bit as strong as his own. Alexander avoided her for 3 days. 3 days of elaborate excuses, business dinners that ran impossibly late, and mornings where he left before the staff even began their duties. Evelyn might have believed his explanations if not for the looks of barely concealed frustration on Mrs. Caldwell's face, or the way Sarah muttered under her breath about stubborn men who wouldn't know a good thing if it bit them on the nose. By Sunday evening, Evelyn had had enough. She waited until she was certain he was in his study. She'd learned to recognize the pattern of his footsteps on the hardwood floors, the way he paced when wrestling with difficult decisions. Armed with a tea service and what remained of her pride, she knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. "Come in." She found him standing behind his massive mahogany desk, shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, his tie discarded somewhere, and the top buttons of his shirt undone. Papers were scattered across the desk surface, and the tension in his shoulders suggested he'd been working for hours without a break. When he looked up and saw her, his entire body went rigid. "Evelyn." Her name sounded strangled. "I thought you'd retired for the evening." "I brought tea," she said simply, setting the tray on the small table near the fireplace. "You missed dinner again." "Business called." "Alexander." Her quiet voice cut through his explanation like silk through steel. "Please don't lie to me." He went very still, and she saw his hands flatten against the desk surface as if he needed the support. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the room that suddenly felt charged with unspoken truths. "You're right," he said finally, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I have been avoiding you." "Why?" Instead of answering, he moved to the window that overlooked the gardens, now silvered in moonlight. His reflection in the glass looked haggard, older than his 41 years, and she felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for whatever demons were driving him. "Because I gave you my word that I wouldn't take advantage of this situation," he said quietly. "And I'm finding it increasingly difficult to keep that promise." Evelyn set down the teacup she'd been holding, her pulse beginning to race. "What if I released you from that promise?" His shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. "You don't know what you're saying, don't I?" She moved closer, drawn by something stronger than wisdom or caution. "I'm not a child, Alexander. I know exactly what I'm saying." "You're grateful," he said, his voice taking on the controlled tone she recognized from their first meetings. "Grateful because I helped your father, because I've treated you with consideration. Gratitude isn't—" "This isn't gratitude." The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended, and finally he turned to face her. This is something I never expected to feel. Something I'm not sure I understand myself." The vulnerability in her admission seemed to undo something in him. She watched the careful control slip from his features, replaced by something raw and hungry that made her breath catch. "Evelyn," he warned, but his voice lacked conviction. She took another step closer, close enough now to see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his pulse beat rapidly at the base of his throat. "The night of the storm you said that caring about me was becoming dangerously easy. The feeling is mutual. You don't understand? Then help me understand." She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles. "Talk to me. Really talk to me. Not the polite conversation we've been dancing around, but the truth." For a moment she thought he would retreat again, would find some excuse to put distance between them. Instead he moved to the fireplace and sank into one of the leather armchairs, suddenly looking every one of his years. "I told you I had a sister," he said without preamble. "Her name was Emma. She was 17 when she died." Evelyn settled into the chair across from him, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. "What happened?" "Car accident. She was supposed to stay home that night. But there was a party." He ran his hands through his hair, the gesture achingly familiar now. "She called me, asked if she could go. I was in a business meeting, irritated at the interruption. I said yes without really listening, just to get off the phone. The pieces began clicking into place. His fierce protectiveness, the way he seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them, the careful distance he maintained even as he cared for her with infinite tenderness. Alexander, that wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? His laugh was bitter, empty. She was my responsibility. Our parents died when she was 12, and I was supposed to take care of her. Instead, I was building an empire, convinced that providing money was the same thing as providing protection. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. You were hardly more than a child yourself. I was 24, old enough to know better, old enough to have said no to one party, to have been present instead of absent. He met her eyes, and the pain there was almost unbearable. I swore after that I would never again be responsible for someone I couldn't protect. But you married me. I married you because I thought I could keep it simple. Provide for you, ensure your security, maintain enough distance to protect us both. His smile was self-deprecating. I hadn't counted on what? On you. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as her. On how you hum when you cook, or the way you curl up in the window seat to read. On how you treat the staff like family, or how you've turned that sterile guest room into something warm and welcoming. On how you look at me like I'm something more than a business arrangement. The intensity in his voice made her pulse race. Alexander, I'm falling in love with you, he said quietly, the words dropping between them like stones into still water. And it terrifies me because I don't know how to love someone without failing them. The confession hung in the air between them, weighted with years of guilt and self-imposed isolation. Evelyn felt her heart break a little for this strong, complicated man who had convinced himself that distance was safety. Without thinking, she rose from her chair and moved to him, kneeling beside his chair so they were at eye level. His breath caught as she reached up to cup his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing the sharp line of his cheekbones. You haven't failed me, she whispered. Not once. Not in any way that matters. Evelyn, you drove through a storm to comfort me. You remember my favorite tea, my favorite books. You've given me more consideration and kindness in these few weeks than I've known in years. Her voice grew stronger, more certain. That's not failure, Alexander. That's love. Something cracked in his expression, years of careful control finally giving way. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I don't know how to do this. How to be a husband instead of a business partner. Neither do I, she admitted, her smile tremulous but genuine. I've never been a wife to anyone but you. We'll learn together. The hope that flickered in his grey eyes was almost too beautiful to bear. Slowly, as if he were handling something infinitely precious, he covered her hands with his own, pressing them more firmly against his face. Are you certain? He asked. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. I won't be able to pretend this is just an arrangement anymore. I don't want you to pretend. She leaned closer, until she could feel his breath warm against her lips. I want this to be real. I want you to be real. For a heartbeat, they stayed suspended in that moment of possibility, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. Then Alexander's restraint finally shattered, and he kissed her with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. It was nothing like the chaste kiss at their wedding. This was hungry, desperate, a claiming that spoke of desire too long denied. His hands tangled in her hair, destroying what remained of her neat chignon, and she melted against him with a soft sound of surrender that seemed to drive him even further beyond reason. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Evelyn, he whispered, her name a prayer and a promise. I know, she whispered back, understanding exactly what he couldn't say. I know. The walls between them had finally crumbled, and there would be no rebuilding them. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as husband and wife in truth, as well as name. The morning after their kiss brought a tentative new dynamic to Thornfield Manor. Evelyn woke to find a single red rose on her breakfast tray, not the white roses Alexander had been leaving, but something deeper, more passionate. The change in color felt like a declaration, an acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted between them. When she joined him for breakfast, the air crackled with awareness. Alexander rose when she entered the morning room, his eyes drinking in her appearance with an intensity that made her skin warm. He held her chair with the same courtesy as always, but when his fingers brushed her shoulders as he settled her at the table, the touch lingered just a moment longer than strictly proper. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying a new intimacy that sent shivers down her spine. "Good morning." She accepted the cup of jasmine tea he poured for her, their fingers brushing as he handed it over. The brief contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, and from the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, she knew he felt it too. They ate in companionable silence, but it was charged with unspoken possibilities. Every glance carried weight, every casual touch, his hand steadying her elbow as she reached for the marmalade, her fingers trailing across his as she passed him the morning paper, felt loaded with promise. "I have meetings in York today," Alexander said as they finished their meal, "but I should be home by 6. Would you like to dine together this evening?" The careful formality of the question, as if they were courting rather than married, made her smile. "I'd love to." His answering smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of careful control and revealing the man beneath the businessman. "I'll see you then." As he prepared to leave, he paused beside her chair. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her goodbye, a casual married intimacy that would have felt both shocking and natural. Instead, he bent and pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his lips lingering in her hair for just a moment longer than necessary. "Have a beautiful day, sweetheart," he murmured against her hair, and the endearment sent warmth flooding through her entire body. After he left, Evelyn found herself moving through the day in a pleasant haze of anticipation. She spent the morning in the gardens with the head gardener, learning about the heritage roses that had been cultivated at Thornfield for generations. The afternoon was devoted to a long, luxurious bath, followed by careful consideration of what to wear for their evening together. She finally selected a dress of deep sapphire blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes and skimmed her curves in a way that was elegant rather than obvious. As she fastened the delicate silver jewelry Alexander had given her as a wedding gift, pieces she'd barely worn before now, she felt like a woman preparing for her first real date with the man she was falling in love with. Alexander returned home precisely at 6, and when she met him in the entrance hall, the way his eyes darkened as they traveled over her appearance made her pulse race. "You look exquisite," he said simply, offering her his arm. Dinner was a revelation. Without the weight of unspoken tension between them, conversation flowed with surprising ease. Alexander proved to be an engaging storyteller, sharing anecdotes from his business travels that revealed both his sharp intelligence and his unexpected sense of humor. She found herself laughing more than she had in months, discovering facets of his personality that his public persona never revealed. "You're different tonight," she observed as they lingered over dessert. "More relaxed." "I feel different," he admitted, swirling the wine in his glass, "as if I've been holding my breath for weeks and can finally exhale." "Is that what you've been doing? Holding your breath?" His gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "From the moment I saw you walking down the aisle toward me, I've been fighting a battle I was destined to lose. Last night, surrendering felt like the most honest thing I've done in years." The raw honesty in his voice made her reach across the table to cover his hand with hers, his fingers immediately intertwined with hers, his thumb tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. "I don't want you to see this as surrender," she said softly. "I want you to see it as choosing. We're both choosing this now. Choosing each other. Choosing each other." After dinner, they walked through the gardens in the soft evening light, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. The late summer air was warm and fragrant, with the scent of jasmine and roses, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink that reflected in the manor's windows. "Tell me about your dreams," Alexander said as they paused beside the fountain at the garden's heart. "Not the practical things, your dreams." Evelyn considered the question, surprised by its unexpectedness. "I used to dream of traveling, seeing the world beyond Yorkshire, experiencing different cultures and cuisines." She smiled softly. "I wanted to cook my way through Italy, learn to make perfect croissants in a Parisian bakery, discover spices in a Moroccan marketplace. Why haven't you?" "Circumstances, father's illness, financial constraints." She shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant about dreams deferred. Reality has a way of reshaping our aspirations. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. What if reality could be reshaped to accommodate dreams instead? Before she could ask what he meant, he drew her closer until she was standing within the circle of his arms. The last rays of sunlight caught in his dark hair, and she could see gold flecks in his grey eyes that she'd never noticed before. "Evelyn," he said quietly, her name a caress on his lips. "Yes? May I kiss you? Properly this time." The question, asked with such formal courtesy despite the heat in his eyes, made her heart race. "Yes," she whispered. This kiss was different from the desperate passion of the night before. This was slow, deliberate, a thorough exploration that spoke of a man taking his time with something precious. His lips moved over hers with gentle pressure, coaxing rather than demanding, and when she responded by rising on her toes to deepen the contact, his arms tightened around her waist. She could taste the wine they'd shared at dinner, could feel the controlled strength in the hands that framed her face as the kiss grew more heated. When his tongue traced the seam of her lips, she opened for him with a soft sigh that seemed to drive him beyond the bounds of his careful restraint. One large hand tangled in her hair while the other pressed against the small of her back, molding her against the hard length of his body. She could feel his heart racing against her chest, could hear the soft sounds of pleasure he made when she boldly met his tongue with her own. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Alexander's forehead rested against hers, his eyes closed as if he were gathering his composure. "I should probably," he began, his voice rough. "Should probably what? Take you inside before I forget we're in full view of the house staff, and do something that would scandalize Mrs. Caldwell." The admission made her laugh, and the sound seemed to delight him. "We can't have that." "Definitely not. Mrs. Caldwell has very firm opinions about proper behavior." But neither of them moved to separate, content to stay wrapped in each other's arms as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. For the first time since her arrival at Thornfield, Evelyn felt truly at home, not just in the beautiful manor, but in the arms of the complicated, passionate man who was proving to be so much more than she'd ever imagined. "Alexander?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For waiting, for letting me choose, for making this real." His arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice carried a depth of emotion that made her chest ache with tenderness. "Thank you for choosing me despite everything, despite the circumstances, despite my reputation, despite the fact that I have no idea how to be the husband you deserve." "You're learning," she murmured against his throat, pressing a soft kiss to the warm skin there. "We both are." As they finally made their way back to the manor, hands intertwined and steps perfectly matched, both understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. They were no longer two strangers bound by a business arrangement, but a man and woman genuinely falling in love, with all the joy and terror that such a transformation entailed. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of growing intimacy and stolen moments. Alexander began arriving home earlier each day, often finding excuses to spend time with Evelyn throughout the afternoon. They would walk through the gardens together, discussing everything from literature to current events, their conversations revealing layers of compatibility neither had expected. The sexual tension between them was becoming almost unbearable. Every touch, his hand guiding her through a doorway, her fingers adjusting his tie at breakfast, sent electricity arcing between them. Alexander's kisses grew more passionate each evening, leaving them both breathless and aching for more than propriety allowed. Yet he continued to sleep in his own room, continued to maintain the careful boundaries he'd established, even as those boundaries grew more fragile with each passing day. Evelyn could see the strain in the tense line of his shoulders, in the way his hands would clench into fists when she leaned against him during their evening conversations. It was during one such evening, as they sat reading together in the library with Evelyn curled against Alexander's side on the large sofa, that Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled distress. "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but there's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's urgent business that can't wait until morning." Alexander's body tensed immediately. "What gentleman?" "A Mr. Marcus Rothwell, sir. He said you'd know what it concerned." The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Evelyn felt him go rigid against her, watched as all the warmth drained from his face to be replaced by the cold mask she hadn't seen in weeks. "Marcus Rothwell is here." His voice was deadly quiet. "Now?" "Yes, sir." "He's waiting in the morning room." Alexander was already rising, his movements sharp and controlled. "Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes." As Mrs. Caldwell hurried away, Evelyn reached for his arm. "Alexander, who is Marcus Rothwell?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. The walls were going back up with frightening speed, the warm, passionate man she'd been falling in love with disappearing behind layers of icy control. "A business associate," he said finally. But his tone suggested the description was woefully inadequate. Someone I'd hoped never to see again. "Alexander, stay here." The command was sharp, authoritative. "Please, this doesn't concern you." But as he strode from the library with military precision, Evelyn knew with sinking certainty that whatever Marcus Rothwell wanted, it absolutely did concern her. She tried to focus on her book, tried to respect Alexander's wishes, but the tension emanating from the morning room was almost palpable. Even from the library she could hear the low murmur of voices, Alexander's controlled tones and another man's smoother, more calculated cadence. After 20 minutes of increasingly agitated waiting, she heard the front door close with unusual force. Alexander's footsteps in the corridor were measured but tense, and when he appeared in the library doorway, his face was a mask of barely controlled fury. "What did he want?" she asked quietly. Alexander moved to the window, staring out at the darkened gardens with hands clasped rigidly behind his back. "To cause trouble. It's what he does best. Alexander, please, talk to me." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. "Marcus Rothwell is my former business partner. We had a disagreement several years ago over certain practices I refused to condone. When I ended our partnership, he threatened to destroy everything I'd built." "What kind of practices?" "The kind that put profit above people. The kind that treat employees as expendable resources rather than human beings." His jaw tightened. "The kind that would have made me exactly the monster everyone believes I am." Evelyn rose and moved to him, placing a gentle hand on his rigid arm. "What did he want tonight?" Alexander closed his eyes, and she saw his careful control wavering. "He knows about us, about our marriage, about the circumstances surrounding it. He's threatening to make it public unless I agree to certain concessions." "What kind of concessions?" "He wants me to reverse my decision about the Blackwell Company. Instead of restructuring to save jobs, he wants me to strip it for parts and sell the profitable divisions to his consortium." Alexander's voice turned bitter. 300 families lose their livelihoods, but Marcus and his investors make millions. "And if you refuse?" He goes to the press with a story about how I bought a wife, how our marriage is nothing but a cold business transaction designed to improve my public image. Alexander finally turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was devastating. "He has photographs from our wedding. How isolated you looked, how obviously reluctant. He has financial records showing the payments to your father's medical bills." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. "He could destroy you. He could destroy us." Alexander's voice was quiet, defeated. "The scandal would be enormous. Your reputation would be shredded alongside mine. Every moment we've shared, every feeling that's grown between us, it would all be painted as manipulation and lies. But that's not what this is anymore," she said fiercely. "Whatever it started as, what we have now is real." "Is it?" The question was barely a whisper, but it cut through her like a blade. "How do we prove that, Evelyn? How do we convince the world or ourselves that what we feel is genuine when it was born from such calculated circumstances?" The doubt in his voice broke her heart. After weeks of careful progress, of walls coming down and trust being built, Marcus Rothwell had managed to poison everything with a single conversation. "You know what we have is real," she said, moving closer to him. "You know it, Alexander. Don't let him take that away from us." "Do I?" He backed away from her outstretched hand, and the distance felt like a chasm. "Or have I simply convinced myself that your gratitude was something deeper? Have I been so desperate for genuine affection that I've misread every sign?" "Stop it!" Her voice was sharp, commanding. "Stop letting his poison infect what we've built. What we've built is a fantasy, Evelyn." The words were brutal, final. A beautiful fantasy that was always destined to crumble when reality intruded. "That's not true, isn't it?" He moved to his desk, pulling out a leather portfolio with mechanical precision. "Marcus was kind enough to remind me of certain facts. Your father's medical bills have been completely paid. The trust I established ensures you'll never want for anything, regardless of what happens to our marriage. You're financially independent now, Evelyn. You don't need me anymore." The implication hung in the air between them like a sword. "Are you asking me to leave? I'm giving you the choice I should have given you from the beginning. The choice to stay or go based on what you truly want, not on obligation or gratitude or financial necessity." Evelyn stared at him, seeing clearly how Marcus Rothwell's visit had shattered Alexander's fragile confidence in their relationship. All his old insecurities, all his fears about being unworthy of genuine love, had come roaring back with devastating force. "And what if what I truly want is you?" she asked quietly. Something flickered in his eyes, hope maybe, or desperate longing, but it was quickly buried beneath layers of protective cynicism. "Then you'll have to prove it. To me, to the world, to yourself. Because in 2 days every newspaper in England is going to be running stories about our marriage. About how the heartless Alexander Thorne bought himself a wife to improve his image. About how you were essentially sold to pay your father's medical bills. Let them write their stories," she said fiercely. "We know the truth." "Do we?" He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Because I'm no longer certain I know the difference between truth and wishful thinking." As Alexander left the library without another word, Evelyn sank into the chair he'd vacated, her mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. In the space of one conversation, their carefully constructed happiness had been blown apart, leaving them both questioning everything they thought they knew about their feelings for each other. But one thing was becoming crystal clear. If she wanted to save their marriage, if she wanted to prove that what they shared was real, she was going to have to fight for it, and she was going to have to do it publicly, in front of a world eager to tear them both apart. The question was whether Alexander would let her fight, or whether Marcus Rothwell had already succeeded in destroying the trust that had taken weeks to build. The next morning brought headlines that made Evelyn's blood run cold. She found Alexander in his study at dawn, surrounded by newspapers whose front pages screamed variations of the same devastating story. Business tycoons bought bride, and the marriage that money made, and most cruelly, Thorne's calculated romance inside the deal that bought a wife. The photographs were worse than the headlines. Images of their wedding day had been cropped and angled to emphasize her obvious reluctance and his cold demeanor. Their first public appearance together at a charity gala was presented as evidence of a relationship based on obligation rather than affection. "Alexander," she whispered, but he didn't look up from the papers spread across his desk. "You should pack," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'll have Charles drive you wherever you'd like to go. Your father's cottage, perhaps, or I can arrange accommodations in London if you prefer." "I'm not leaving. Evelyn, I said I'm not leaving." She moved around the desk to face him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "This is exactly what Marcus Rothwell wanted, to drive a wedge between us, to make you doubt everything we've built." "What we've built is under siege," Alexander replied, finally looking at her with eyes that seemed years older than they had yesterday. "My phone has been ringing since 5 this morning. Reporters, board members, business associates, everyone wants to know if the stories are true. And what are you telling them? The truth, that our marriage began as a business arrangement." Evelyn felt as if he'd struck her. "And the rest? What we've become? How do I explain that, Evelyn? How do I convince them, or myself, that it's real when I can't even prove it to my own board of directors?" Before she could answer, Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, her usually composed face tight with stress. "Sir, there are reporters at the gates, quite a few of them, and Mr. Patterson from the board is on line 1, insisting on speaking with you immediately." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Tell the reporters they're trespassing. Call security if necessary. As for Patterson, tell him I'll call him back." "Sir, he says it's urgent. Something about the Blackwell acquisition and emergency board meetings." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Evelyn watched the last of his hope drain away as he realized the full scope of Marcus Rothwell's attack. It wasn't just their personal lives under assault. It was his professional reputation, his business empire, everything he'd spent years building. "Take the call," Evelyn said quietly. "Handle whatever needs handling. But Alexander, don't make any decisions about us while you're in crisis mode." He stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his grey eyes. "Why are you still here, Evelyn? Why aren't you running from this disaster?" "Because I love you," she said simply, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "I love you, not your money or your reputation or what you can provide for me. I love the man who drove through a storm to comfort me, who remembers my favorite tea, who worries about factory workers he's never met. I love you, Alexander, and I'm not going to let Marcus Rothwell or anyone else destroy that." For a heartbeat, his mask slipped, and she saw naked longing in his expression. Then Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat delicately, and the walls went back up. "I have to take this call," he said roughly. "I know, but when you're finished handling the crisis, we're going to talk. Really talk. About what this means and what we're going to do about it." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Evelyn?" "Yes?" He seemed to struggle with the words. "Thank you. For staying. For fighting." She smiled, though her heart was breaking at the distance he was maintaining even now. "You're worth fighting for, Alexander. I just hope you remember that." The day passed in a blur of crisis management. Evelyn watched from the sidelines as Alexander fielded calls from board members, lawyers, and public relations specialists. She saw the toll it was taking on him, the tight lines around his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he seemed to age years with each conversation. But she also saw something else, his fundamental decency shining through even in crisis. When his lawyer suggested exploiting legal loopholes to discredit Marcus Rothwell, Alexander refused. When his PR team recommended throwing her under the bus to protect his image, he shut down the conversation immediately. By evening, the reporters had been cleared from the gates, but the damage was spreading through social media and business networks like wildfire. Alexander's stock prices were dropping, and calls for his resignation from various boards were gaining momentum. "They want me to step down from the Blackwell acquisition," he told her over a dinner neither of them had appetite for. "The board thinks my personal scandal makes me a liability," which is exactly what Marcus Rothwell intended. "Perhaps they're right. Perhaps I am a liability." "Stop." She reached across the table and grasped his hand, feeling the tension thrumming through him. "Stop letting him win. Stop letting doubt poison what we know is true." "And what is true, Evelyn? Because right now I can't see past the wreckage." She stood and moved around the table to him, taking his face in her hands with the same gentle authority she'd used the night he'd finally opened up to her. "The truth is that I chose you. Not your money, not your protection. You. The man who carries the weight of the world on his shoulders, but still finds time to leave roses on my breakfast tray. The man who thinks saving 300 jobs is more important than making millions in profit. Evelyn, the truth is that I would rather face this scandal with you than live in comfort without you. The truth is that Marcus Rothwell is terrified of who you've become, a man with a conscience, a man who can't be bought or intimidated. So he's trying to tear you down before you can prove that business can be conducted with honor." Alexander's hands came up to cover hers, and she felt some of the tension leave his body. "I don't know how to fight this battle. Then let me help you fight it, as your wife, as your partner, as the woman who loves you enough to stand beside you no matter what the cost." For the first time all day, something like hope flickered in his eyes. "It won't be easy. The scandal will get worse before it gets better. I'm not afraid of scandals, Alexander. I'm only afraid of losing you." As he pulled her down onto his lap and held her close, both of them understood that the real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since Marcus Rothwell's visit, they would face it together. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, and by Thursday evening, Alexander's lawyers were painting an increasingly grim picture. Marcus Rothwell had orchestrated his attack with surgical precision, timing the media blitz to coincide with crucial business negotiations and using Alexander's personal scandal to undermine his professional credibility. "They're calling for a vote of no confidence," his lead attorney James Morrison explained, as they huddled in Alexander's study. "Rothwell has convinced enough board members that your judgment is compromised. If they succeed, you'll be forced to step down from several key positions." Evelyn watched from her chair by the fireplace as Alexander absorbed this latest blow. His face remained impassive, but she could see the muscle ticking in his jaw, the way his hands clenched into fists on the desk surface. "What are our options?" Alexander asked quietly. "Limited. We could try to discredit Rothwell, but that would mean a protracted legal battle that could drag on for years. Or—" Morrison hesitated, glancing meaningfully at Evelyn. "We could consider the alternative he's proposed, which is, give him what he wants regarding the Blackwell acquisition, and he'll retract his statements to the press. Claim it was all a misunderstanding based on incomplete information." The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn felt sick as she realized what was being suggested, that Alexander sacrifice his principles and 300 jobs to save his reputation. "I won't do it," Alexander said finally. "I won't destroy innocent families to protect myself." "Alexander," Morrison said carefully, "you need to think about this pragmatically. If you're forced out of your current positions, you'll have no power to help anyone. Sometimes strategic retreat is the wisest course." "Strategic retreat?" Alexander's voice was bitter. "Is that what we're calling cowardice now?" Before Morrison could respond, Evelyn stood up abruptly. "There's another option." Both men turned to look at her, and she felt a moment of doubt. What she was about to propose would change everything, would expose them both to even more scrutiny. But as she met Alexander's eyes across the room, she saw a flicker of trust there that gave her courage. "We tell our story," she said simply. "Not defensive explanations or damage control, the real story. How we met, what our marriage has become, why Alexander is fighting for the Blackwell Company. We take control of the narrative instead of letting Marcus Rothwell write it for us." Morrison looked skeptical. "Mrs. Thorne, with respect, that's an enormous risk. Public sentiment is already against you both. Going public could backfire spectacularly. Or it could show people who Alexander really is," Evelyn replied firmly. "Not the cold businessman they think they know, but the man who drove through a storm to comfort his wife. The man who's risking his own fortune to save other people's jobs." Alexander was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Evelyn, you don't understand what you're suggesting. The scrutiny would be intense. Every aspect of our relationship would be dissected in public. They'd question your motives, your sincerity. Let them." She moved to stand beside his chair, placing her hand on his shoulder. "I'd rather face their questions together than let Marcus Rothwell destroy everything you've worked for." "How?" Morrison asked practically. "What are you proposing, exactly?" Evelyn took a deep breath, the plan crystallizing in her mind, even as she spoke. "The Eastwood Foundation's charity gala is tomorrow night. Alexander was supposed to speak about corporate responsibility. It's the perfect venue. Instead of a business speech, he tells the truth about us. About how our marriage began, yes, but also about what it's become. And I stand beside him not as a victim of circumstances, but as a woman who chose her husband." "That's—" Morrison began, then stopped, his expression thoughtful. "That's actually brilliant. The guest list includes major investors, media figures, and business leaders. If you could win over that room—" "It's dangerous," Alexander said quietly. "If we fail, if they don't believe us, it would finish us completely." Evelyn turned to face him fully, her hand moving to cup his cheek. "Do you trust me?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with everything they'd been through, everything they'd built together. She saw him struggle with it, saw fear and hope warring in his grey eyes. "Yes," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I trust you. Then trust us. Trust what we have together. Trust that it's strong enough to withstand whatever they throw at us." Alexander stood slowly, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "If we do this, there's no going back. Win or lose, everything changes." "Everything already changed the night you told me you were falling in love with me," she replied softly. "This is just making it official." He studied her face for a long moment, and she could almost see the moment he made his decision. The fear didn't disappear, but it was overshadowed by something stronger, determination, and beneath that, love. "All right," he said, turning to Morrison. "Cancel my prepared remarks for tomorrow night. I'll be speaking about something else entirely." As Morrison packed up his papers and prepared to leave, muttering about impossible clients and career-ending strategies, Alexander pulled Evelyn into his arms. "Are you certain about this?" he asked against her hair. "Once we do this, we can't take it back. I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she replied, meaning every word. Alexander, what we have is real. It's beautiful and messy and complicated and absolutely real. It's time the world knew that. He held her tighter, and she could feel some of his tension melting away. I love you, he whispered. Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that. I love you completely, irrevocably, with everything I am. I love you too, she whispered back, and tomorrow night everyone is going to know it. As they stood together in the quiet of his study, surrounded by the debris of Marcus Rothwell's attack, they both understood that they were about to gamble everything on the strength of their love. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely necessary. Tomorrow night, they would stand before the most influential people in England and lay their hearts bare. They would risk everything for the chance to prove that love, real transformative love, could triumph over scandal, manipulation, and doubt. The question was whether their love was strong enough to convince a room full of skeptics. Evelyn believed it was. Now they just had to prove it. The Eastwood Foundation's annual charity gala was held at the Grand Ballroom of the Savoy Hotel, its opulent chandeliers casting golden light over London's elite. Evelyn stood before her mirror at Thornfield, adjusting the emerald necklace that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, a piece he'd given her that morning with trembling hands and eyes full of unspoken emotion. Her gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that Alexander had commissioned weeks ago before the scandal broke. It fit her like liquid starlight, elegant and sophisticated without being ostentatious. She'd chosen to wear her hair in a simple chignon, letting the dramatic neckline of the dress and the vintage emeralds speak for themselves. But it was her wedding ring that drew her attention. The delicate band that had felt so foreign on her finger just months ago now felt like a part of her. Tonight, it would serve as both shield and weapon in the battle for their future. Alexander appeared in the doorway of her room, devastatingly handsome in his black tie, formal wear. The sight of him in perfectly tailored evening attire still made her breath catch, but it was the vulnerability in his eyes that made her heart ache with love. "You look magnificent," he said quietly, his voice carrying a roughness that betrayed his emotions. "So do you." She moved to him, straightening his already perfect bow tie with hands that trembled slightly. "Are you ready for this?" His hands covered hers, stilling their nervous movements. "With you beside me, I'm ready for anything." The drive to London passed in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined as they watched the Yorkshire countryside give way to the glittering lights of the city. Photographers were already positioned outside the Savoy when their car arrived, camera flashes exploding like fireworks as Alexander helped her from the vehicle. "Mrs. Thorne, is it true your marriage was arranged?" "Mr. Thorne, how do you respond to allegations of buying a wife?" The questions came rapid fire, but they walked through the gauntlet with dignity, Alexander's hand steady and protective on her back. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Evelyn could feel hundreds of eyes on them as they moved through the crowd, conversations stopping mid-sentence as people turned to stare at the couple at the center of England's most talked-about scandal. "There's Marcus Rothwell," Alexander murmured, nodding toward a silver-haired man holding court near the bar. Even from across the room, Evelyn could see the smugness in his posture, the satisfaction of a predator who believed his prey was cornered. "He looks confident," she observed. "He should be. Half the people in this room have already written us off." Alexander's jaw tightened. "The other half are here to watch the execution." But as they mingled through the cocktail hour, Evelyn began to notice something unexpected. While some guests were openly hostile or coolly distant, others seemed genuinely curious about their story. Mrs. Helena Ashworth, the Foundation's director, embraced Evelyn warmly and whispered that she'd never seen Alexander look so happy. Several business associates mentioned positive changes they'd noticed in his recent decisions. "You have more allies than you think," Evelyn murmured as they took their seats for dinner. When the time came for speeches, Evelyn felt her heart begin to race. Alexander squeezed her hand once, firmly, then rose to make his way to the podium. The ballroom fell silent as he adjusted the microphone, his tall frame commanding attention even from those who had come to see him fall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed space. "I had prepared remarks tonight about corporate responsibility and charitable giving. Instead, I want to talk to you about truth, A murmur rippled through the crowd. From her seat at the head table, Evelyn could see Marcus Rothwell's confident expression beginning to waver. "By now you've all read the stories about my marriage, about how I allegedly bought a wife to improve my public image, about how my relationship with Evelyn is nothing more than a calculated business arrangement." Alexander's eyes found hers across the room, and she saw love and determination burning there. "Those stories are both completely true and utterly false." The contradiction sent another wave of whispers through the audience. "It's true that our marriage began as an arrangement. Evelyn's father was dying, and medical treatments he couldn't afford were his only hope. I had the resources to help, and I needed—" Alexander paused, his voice roughening with emotion. "I needed someone to remind me what it meant to be human." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her husband lay his soul bare before hundreds of strangers. "What those stories don't tell you is how she transformed my life, how she taught me that power without compassion is meaningless, how she showed me that protecting people is more important than protecting profits." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. "The woman I married out of obligation became the woman I love with every fiber of my being." He gestured toward her, and she stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room focus on her as she made her way to the podium. Alexander's hand found hers immediately, their fingers intertwining as she stepped up beside him. "My husband just told you how our marriage began," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her racing heart. "Now let me tell you what it became. Let me tell you about the man who drove through a thunderstorm because he couldn't bear the thought of me facing it alone. About the man who is risking his own fortune to save 300 jobs at the Blackwell Company because he believes every family deserves security." She turned to face Alexander, speaking to him as much as to their audience. "Yes, I married you for my father's sake, but I'm standing here tonight by choice. I'm standing here because I love the man you are, not the wealth you possess or the power you wield, but the heart you keep hidden from the world." The ballroom was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on their words. "Marcus Rothwell wants to destroy my husband because Alexander represents everything he isn't: integrity, compassion, the courage to do what's right instead of what's profitable." Evelyn's voice carried a steel that surprised even her. "He's using our love story as a weapon because he can't compete with the man Alexander has become." Alexander squeezed her hand, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a new strength. "Tomorrow, some of you will vote on whether I should be forced to step down from various positions. I won't ask you to ignore the circumstances of my marriage. I will ask you to judge me on the man those circumstances helped me become." "Judge us both," Evelyn added, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "Judge our marriage not on how it began, but on what it's become. Judge Alexander not on old rumors and calculated attacks, but on the choices he's making every day to build something better." As they left the podium together, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, came the sound of slow, steady applause. Mrs. Ashworth stood first, then others began rising, until half the ballroom was on their feet in support. It wasn't universal. Marcus Rothwell and his allies remained seated, their faces dark with fury. But it was enough. Enough to show that their truth had resonated, that their love had the power to change minds and hearts. As the evening wound down and guests approached to offer support or ask questions, Evelyn felt a profound sense of relief. They had done it. They had stood before their harshest critics and bared their souls, and they had survived. "Whatever happens now," Alexander murmured against her ear as they prepared to leave, "we face it together." "Together," she agreed, knowing that whatever the morning brought, they had already won the only battle that truly mattered, the fight for their love and their future. The morning after the gala brought a transformation that neither Alexander nor Evelyn had dared hope for. The headlines that had been so vicious just days before now told a different story. "Love conquers all," "The Thorns' inspiring truth," and "When business becomes personal, a marriage that changed everything." Alexander sat in his study, reading the coverage with an expression of amazed disbelief. The Times had published an editorial praising his stance on corporate responsibility. The Financial Post wrote about the refreshing honesty of his speech. Even the tabloids, while still sensationalized, had shifted their focus from scandal to romance. "Listen to this," he called to Evelyn, who was curled in the window seat with her own collection of newspapers. The Guardian says, "In an age of calculated political messaging, the raw honesty of Alexander and Evelyn Thorne's public declaration reminds us that authentic emotion still has the power to move hearts and change minds." Evelyn looked up from the society pages, which were breathlessly analyzing every detail of her gown and jewelry from the night before. "The Telegraph is calling us the couple that redefined what marriage means in the modern age." The sound of the telephone interrupted their review of the coverage. Alexander answered it with the wariness that had become second nature over the past week, but his expression quickly shifted to one of genuine surprise. "James, good morning." He listened for several minutes, his eyebrows rising steadily. "I see, yes, that is unexpected. Very well, I'll be there within the hour." "Good news?" Evelyn asked as he hung up. "The board meeting has been cancelled. Apparently, 3 board members who were firmly in Rothwell's camp called this morning to withdraw their support for the vote of no confidence." Alexander's smile was incredulous. "They said last night's speech changed their perspective on my leadership capabilities." Before Evelyn could respond, Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Sir, madam, you have visitors. Rather a lot of them, actually." "Reporters?" Alexander asked, immediately tensing. "No, sir. Business associates, I believe. They're gathering in the morning room and more keep arriving. They say they're here to show support." As they made their way to the morning room, they found it filled with some of the most influential business leaders in England, men and women who had built empires, shaped policy, and commanded respect across industries, had come to Thornfield Manor to personally express their support. Alexander, Sir William Hartford, chairman of Hartford Industries, approached with an outstretched hand. "That was the finest speech I've heard in 40 years of business. Raw courage, my boy, raw courage." Lady Catherine Pemberton, who controlled one of England's largest investment firms, embraced Evelyn warmly. "My dear, you were magnificent last night. The way you stood by your husband, the dignity with which you faced those vultures. It reminded me why I still believe in the power of authentic partnerships." For the next 2 hours, they received congratulations, offers of support, and business propositions from people who had previously maintained careful distance. The message was clear. By risking everything to tell their truth, they had gained something far more valuable than reputation. They had gained respect. When the last visitor departed, Alexander and Evelyn found themselves alone in the morning room, surrounded by the flowers and cards that had been delivered throughout the day. "I can't quite believe it," Alexander said quietly. "Marcus Rothwell's attack has backfired completely. Instead of destroying us, it's made us stronger." "That's because we didn't try to hide from the truth," Evelyn replied, moving to stand before him. "We owned it, all of it, the arrangement, the evolution, the love that grew from unlikely circumstances." Alexander's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing gentle arcs across her cheekbones. "You saved me last night, not just my reputation or my business. You saved me. We saved each other," she corrected softly. "The moment you decided to trust me, to trust us, was the moment we became truly unstoppable." His kiss was gentle at first, a tender expression of gratitude and love. But as she responded, rising on her toes to deepen the contact, passion flared between them with an intensity that left them both breathless. "Evelyn," he murmured against her lips, his voice rough with desire and something deeper. "I need to tell you something." "What?" she whispered, her hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt. "I love you so much it terrifies me. I love your courage, your kindness, the way you see the best in people even when they can't see it themselves. I love how you've changed me, challenged me, made me want to be worthy of you." Tears pricked her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "Alexander, I know our marriage began as an arrangement, but I want to start again. I want to choose you every day for the rest of my life. I want to be your husband not because of a contract, but because I can't imagine existing without you." The intensity in his grey eyes took her breath away. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to marry you again. Really marry you this time, with vows we write ourselves and promises we make by choice rather than necessity. I want the whole world to know that you are my wife because we both chose it, not because circumstances forced it." Evelyn felt her heart swell until she thought it might burst. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course, yes." His kiss this time was claiming, possessive, full of promises for their future. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling with emotion and desire. "There's something else," Alexander said, his voice unsteady. "I've made a decision about the Blackwell Company. Regardless of what the board wants, I'm going ahead with the restructuring. Those 300 families are more important than profits, and I have you to thank for reminding me of that. What about Marcus Rothwell? What about his threats?" Alexander's smile was fierce, triumphant. "Marcus Rothwell no longer has any power over us. The board is behind me, public opinion has shifted, and his attempt to destroy us has only made us stronger. He's finished." As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway with a telephone message. "Sir, a Mr. Rothwell called. He asked me to tell you that he's withdrawing his opposition to the Blackwell acquisition and will be making no further public statements about your marriage." Alexander read the message with grim satisfaction. He knows when he's beaten. "So what happens now?" Evelyn asked, still trying to process the rapid reversal of their fortunes. "Now we live our lives. We run the business together. I hope you'll consider taking an active role in the company's charitable initiatives. We plan our second wedding. We travel to all those places you dreamed of seeing." His eyes were bright with possibility. "We build the life we want, together." As evening fell over Thornfield Manor, Alexander and Evelyn stood on their balcony overlooking the gardens where they had shared their first real kiss. The scandal that had threatened to destroy them had instead forged them into something stronger, more united than they had ever imagined possible. "Thank you," Alexander said quietly, his arms wrapped around her from behind. "For what? For fighting for us, for believing in us when I couldn't, for showing me that love isn't something to be feared, but something to be celebrated." Evelyn leaned back against his chest, feeling truly safe for the first time in months. "Thank you for letting me fight, for trusting me enough to take the risk." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they both understood that their real love story was just beginning. The arrangement that had brought them together was history. What lay ahead was a future built on choice, trust, and a love strong enough to weather any storm. 3 weeks after their public declaration, Alexander and Evelyn renewed their vows in the same stone church where their journey had begun. This time, however, the ceremony was filled with genuine joy rather than resigned duty. Evelyn wore a gown of ivory silk that Alexander had commissioned from Paris, and when he saw her walking down the aisle, radiant, willing, choosing him, tears of gratitude slipped down his cheeks. Their second honeymoon took them to Tuscany, where they spent lazy afternoons cooking together in the kitchen of a rented villa, and passionate nights discovering the depths of their desire for each other. It was during one such evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows of their bedroom, that Alexander finally claimed his wife completely. "Are you certain?" he asked for the dozenth time, his hands trembling as they framed her face in the candlelight. They were both naked, skin flushed with arousal and anticipation, but he couldn't stop himself from seeking her permission one more time. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice thick with desire and love, "I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I want this. I want you. I want to be yours completely." The last of his restraint crumbled at her words. He kissed her with years of pent-up longing, his mouth moving over hers with a reverence that spoke of worship rather than mere passion. Every touch was a prayer, every caress a promise of devotion that would last a lifetime. When he finally joined their bodies, both cried out at the perfection of it, not just the physical pleasure, though that was overwhelming, but the emotional completion of finally becoming one in truth, as well as name. They moved together with an instinctive rhythm, whispering words of love and need, until the boundaries between them dissolved entirely. In the aftermath, as they lay entwined in the rumpled sheets, Alexander traced patterns on Evelyn's bare shoulder, with fingers that still shook slightly. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "Beyond reason, beyond measure, beyond anything I thought myself capable of feeling." "Show me," she whispered, turning in his arms to face him. "Show me every day for the rest of our lives." They returned to England as true partners in every sense. Evelyn took an active role in Thorn Industries' charitable initiatives, her natural warmth and intelligence making her invaluable in negotiations and public relations. Alexander, meanwhile, seemed to shed years of accumulated stress, his smiles coming easier and his laughter more frequent. The Blackwell Company restructuring was hailed as a model of ethical business practices. Not only were all 300 jobs saved, but the company became more profitable than ever under Alexander's guidance. Marcus Rothwell, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated as other business leaders distanced themselves from his ruthless tactics. One evening in early December, as snow began to dust the grounds of Thornfield Manor, Alexander found Evelyn in the library reading by the fireplace. She looked up when he entered, and her smile was so radiant that it took his breath away even after months of marriage. "Good day at the office?" she asked, setting aside her book to make room for him on the sofa. "Productive," he replied, settling beside her and pulling her close. "I have something for you." "It's not my birthday," she protested, but her eyes were bright with curiosity. "It doesn't need to be a special occasion for me to give my wife a gift," he said, producing a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "Besides, this is overdue." Inside the box lay a ring that made her gasp, an exquisite emerald surrounded by diamonds, clearly antique and obviously precious beyond measure. "It was my grandmother's engagement ring," Alexander explained, his voice soft with emotion. "I should have given it to you months ago, when I first realized I was falling in love with you. Consider it a symbol of the choice we've both made." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger beside her wedding band. "Alexander, it's magnificent." "You're magnificent," he corrected, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her palm. "You took a broken man and taught him how to love again. You took a marriage of convenience and turned it into the greatest romance of my life." Their kiss was interrupted by Mrs. Caldwell's discreet cough from the doorway. "Forgive me, sir, madam, but dinner is served, and might I say, it's lovely to see you both so happy." As they made their way to the dining room hand in hand, Evelyn marveled at how completely her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a frightened young woman walking down the aisle toward an uncertain future. Now she was a confident wife, a valued partner, and most importantly, a woman deeply loved by the man beside her. After dinner, they walked through the snow-dusted gardens, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Alexander stopped beside the fountain where he had first kissed her properly, pulling her into his arms. "I have a confession," he said, his grey eyes twinkling with mischief. "Oh, what's that?" "I think I was falling in love with you from the moment you walked down that aisle. You looked so brave, so determined to face whatever came next. I knew then that you were going to change my life. I just didn't realize how completely." Evelyn laughed, the sound crystalline in the cold air. "And I thought you were the most intimidating man I'd ever seen. I never imagined that behind all that control was someone who would love me so completely that I'd forget what loneliness felt like." "Never again," Alexander promised, spinning her around until she laughed breathlessly. "You'll never be lonely again, Mrs. Thorne. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure of that." As they returned to the warmth of the manor, both understood that their story had become everything they'd never dared hope for. What had begun as a business arrangement had blossomed into a love story for the ages, one that would sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring. In the master bedroom they now shared, Alexander made love to his wife with a tenderness and passion that left them both trembling. As they lay afterward in the warm circle of each other's arms, watching snow fall past their windows, Evelyn felt a profound sense of completion. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, his fingers combing gently through her hair. "Just this, us. How perfect it all feels now." "It is perfect," he agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You're perfect. Our love is perfect. Our life together is going to be perfect." "I love you, Alexander Thorne," she whispered against his chest. "And I love you, Evelyn Thorne. Always and forever." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Thornfield Manor in pristine white, a fresh start for a couple who had found in each other not just love, but the promise of a lifetime of happiness. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the breakfast room at Thornfield Manor, illuminating a scene of domestic bliss that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. Alexander sat reading the Financial Times, while Evelyn prepared her favorite jasmine tea, humming softly as she moved about the room with the natural grace that never failed to captivate him. But this morning held a special significance that neither had yet acknowledged aloud, though both were acutely aware of the small velvet box hidden in Alexander's jacket pocket and the nervous energy that had been building between them for days. "The Blackwell Company's quarterly reports came in yesterday," Alexander said, folding his newspaper as Evelyn settled beside him with her tea. "Profits are up 30%, and employee satisfaction surveys are at an all-time high." "I'm not surprised," Evelyn replied, her hand automatically moving to rest over his. "When people feel valued and secure, they do their best work. You've proven that compassion and profitability aren't mutually exclusive." Alexander lifted their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles, marveling, as he always did, at how naturally she supported and understood his business philosophy. In the months since their public declaration, she had become not just his wife, but his most trusted advisor, her insights often proving more valuable than those of his highly paid consultants. "There's something else," he said, his voice carrying a note of carefully controlled excitement. "I've been asked to speak at the Global Business Ethics Conference in Geneva next month. They want to use our story, both personal and professional, as a case study in how authentic leadership can transform corporate culture." Evelyn's eyes lit up with pride. "Alexander, that's wonderful. You deserve the recognition." "We deserve it," he corrected firmly. "None of this would have been possible without you. Which brings me to something I've been wanting to discuss." Before he could continue, Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway with her usual impeccable timing. "Sir, your father is on the telephone. He says it's about the Ashworth wedding this weekend." Alexander rose to take the call, but not before dropping a meaningful kiss on Evelyn's forehead. "Hold that thought," he murmured. "We have important things to discuss." As his footsteps disappeared down the corridor, Evelyn found herself touching the spot where his lips had lingered, her heart racing with anticipation. She had her own news to share, news that would change their lives in the most wonderful way possible, but she wanted to wait for the perfect moment. The Ashworth wedding that weekend provided that moment. Helena Ashworth, the foundation director who had become a dear friend, was marrying her longtime partner in a ceremony that celebrated love in all its forms. As Alexander and Evelyn waltzed together at the reception, surrounded by friends who had witnessed their own transformation from reluctant spouses to devoted partners, the time felt right for revelations. "You look beautiful tonight," Alexander murmured as they swayed to the gentle music. Evelyn wore a gown of champagne silk that seemed to glow in the candlelight, and the emerald ring he'd given her caught the light with each movement of her hand. "You look rather handsome yourself," she replied, straightening his bow tie with the same tender gesture she'd made countless times before. But tonight her touch lingered, and when she met his eyes, he saw something there that made his breath catch. "Evelyn?" His voice was questioning, hopeful. "Let's walk," she suggested softly. "I have something wonderful to tell you." They slipped away from the reception to wander through the hotel's private gardens, the sound of music and laughter fading behind them. Under a canopy of stars, beside a fountain that reminded them both of the one at Thornfield, where they'd shared their first passionate kiss, Alexander finally produced the velvet box he'd been carrying for weeks. "Before you tell me your news," he said, dropping to one knee with fluid grace, "I have something to ask you." Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth in surprise, though tears of joy were already gathering in her eyes. "I know we're already married," Alexander continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I know we've already promised to love each other for better or worse, but I want to ask you properly this time, without contracts or arrangements or anything but pure love motivating the question." He opened the box to reveal a second ring, not to replace the emerald he'd already given her, but to complement it. This one was a simple band of platinum set with diamonds that caught the starlight like captured dreams. "Evelyn Margaret Thorne," he said, her full married name a caress on his lips. "Will you marry me? Not because circumstances require it, not because duty demands it, but because you choose me, because you want to spend the rest of your life building something beautiful with me." "Yes," she whispered, then louder, laughing through her tears. "Yes, of course, yes. But Alexander, I have something to tell you too, something that makes this moment even more perfect." He slipped the new ring onto her finger, then rose to take her face in his hands. "What is it, my love?" "We're going to have a baby," she whispered, her voice shaking with joy and nervous excitement. "I saw the doctor yesterday. We're going to be parents, Alexander." The silence that followed was profound, as if the entire world had paused to acknowledge the magnitude of this moment. Alexander's face cycled through surprise, wonder, and finally, joy so pure it took Evelyn's breath away. "A baby," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "We're going to have a baby?" "In about 7 months," she confirmed, then laughed as he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. When he finally set her down, his hands immediately moved to her still flat stomach, his touch reverent and protective. "I can't believe it. We're going to be a family." "We already are a family," Evelyn corrected gently. "This just makes it official." Their kiss was tender, full of promises for the future and gratitude for the present. When they finally returned to the reception, hand in hand and glowing with happiness, their friends immediately noticed the change in them. "Well?" Helena asked knowingly, having observed their absence and their radiant return. "Do we have something to celebrate?" "We have everything to celebrate," Alexander replied, his arm tight around Evelyn's waist. "We're expecting a baby." The cheer that went up from their friends was heartfelt and joyous, but nothing could compare to the quiet moment later that evening when they returned to Thornfield, and Alexander knelt beside their bed to press gentle kisses to Evelyn's stomach. "Hello, little one," he whispered against her skin. "This is your father speaking. I want you to know that you're already so loved, so wanted. Your mother and I can't wait to meet you." As the months passed, Alexander proved to be every bit as protective and devoted an expectant father as Evelyn had known he would be. He attended every doctor's appointment, read every pregnancy book he could find, and spent hours talking to their unborn child each night, sharing stories about Thornfield Manor and making promises about the adventures they would have together. The baby arrived on a crisp spring morning, a perfect little boy with his father's grey eyes and his mother's gentle temperament. Alexander cried openly when he first held his son, his large hands cradling the tiny bundle with infinite tenderness. "He's perfect," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." "Just like his father," Evelyn murmured sleepily, her heart overflowing as she watched her husband fall completely in love with their child. They named him William Edward Thorne, after Evelyn's father, who had recovered enough to attend the christening 6 weeks later. The same church that had witnessed their arranged marriage and their renewal of vows now blessed their child, completing the circle of their love story. As Alexander stood at the altar, holding his son while Evelyn glowed beside him, surrounded by friends who had become family and staff who had watched their love story unfold, he reflected on the miracle of their journey. What had begun as a desperate arrangement had become the greatest love story of his life. "What are you thinking about?" Evelyn asked softly, noting the contemplative expression on his face. "Just this, all of it. How perfectly everything worked out." He shifted their son to one arm so he could pull her close with the other. "1.5 years ago, I was a man convinced he was incapable of love. Now I have everything I never knew I wanted." "We both do," she agreed, smiling up at him with eyes full of love and contentment. "We found our happily ever after, didn't we?" "Better than happily ever after," Alexander replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead as their son slept peacefully in his arms. "We found forever." As they left the church together, husband, wife, and child, the sun broke through the clouds to bathe them in golden light, a benediction on a love story that had transformed them all. Behind them, the bells of St. Michael's rang out across the Yorkshire countryside, announcing to the world that sometimes, just sometimes, fairy tales do come true. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.